Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the second Nutrition Research Program session at the Almond Conference. This session features some of the best nutrition researchers in the area of blood glucose regulation and their research results. I'll begin with a brief introduction to myself. My name is Swati Kalgaonkar. And I head the Nutrition Research Program for the Almond Board of California. I have a PhD in nutritional science, and my primary focus at ABC is oversight of ABC contracted nutrition research, public policy analysis and synthesis, and information dissemination in support of the almond industry's global strategies. We're very grateful today to Drs. Ortiz, Dylan, Dr. Madan, who's actually joining us virtually, and Dr. Kalida for joining us today to present the results of their research on almonds. So I'll begin with Dr. Rudy Ortiz. Dr. Ortiz is a professor in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology at the University of California, Merced. He also serves as a member on the Nutrition Research Committee. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to him. We will have our Q&A session at the very end, so please hold your questions till then. And we have one microphone over here, which is what we'll be using for the Q&A session. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Ortiz. Thank you. These were the introductions I forgot.
And we didn't find a pointer? Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. And before I get started, I'd like to extend a thank you to the Almond Board of California for this generous invitation to present to you this morning. I will be talking about a brief review and potential implications of current results, summarizing what we know about almond interventions and glucose regulation. Before I get started, I just want to mention disclosures. I'm a member of Nutrition Research Council for Almond Board, a past funded researcher, but I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So to get started, I want to put the work that we're doing into context with respect to human health, not just nationally, but globally. And so these are data that are collected by the CDC every 4 years. And unfortunately, I don't have a pointer, but pay attention to your favorite region of the US and look at that color. As I go through these slides, you will begin to see how the colors change dramatically. And as they go towards, how do we go back? As they go from the lighter colors to the darker colors, this is an indication of the increased prevalence of obesity and diabetes. And if you can look at the Central Valley, Merced is in yellow, and that is a region of highest prevalence of diabetes. But we have additional research from my lab that was published about 6 years ago showing that not only is it the highest region of diabetes prevalence, but it also has among the highest prevalence of adolescent obesity with prevalence percentages greater than the national average, suggesting that we're in a region that is exposed to a very high prevalence of both diabetes and obesity. And when these two metabolic disorders combine, it's characterized by a condition known as diabesity. So it's obesity-induced diabetes, which complicates the treatment and management of the condition. thankfully, there has been quite a bit of work in almonds with a focus on glucose regulation. And a number of studies have calculated no or very minimal effects of nuts on pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic subjects in ameliorating that condition. But again, these are nut studies in general, not almonds specifically, but just to give some idea. But there was one study by David Jenkins' group just recently showing that nut consumption, when replacing a high carbohydrate in the diet of type 2 diabetic subjects, there was an improvement in glucose control, which is encouraging. A meta-analysis demonstrated that there's very little benefit of nuts in general on prevalence or prevention of type 2 diabetes in individuals at risk. And this data here shows, I wish I had a pointer, I could emphasize some points here, but the idea here is that there does not seem to be a robust benefit regardless of the study design, whether cross-sectional studies or prospective cohort studies, suggesting that study design could be a critical component to developing future studies. When we look at the almond data, almond consumption independently is associated with better glycemic metrics or metrics of glucose regulation. When these data here summarize what the effects are following various intervention times and dosages, but what we see is that depending on the type of study, there seems to be some modest benefits. However, almonds have been shown to have no effect on glucoregulatory metrics in healthy subjects and modest effects in type 2 diabetics. There's a number of other studies as well showing very modest effects. But I want to emphasize that these studies are using a single time point measurement at the end of study to assess glucose regulation, and that's very difficult to do with very complex regulatory conditions when we're talking about glucose. So more robust analyses may prove to be more fruitful when we're talking about almond interventions and glucose regulations. I'm now going to focus on a number of studies which have reported the glucose excursions or glucose tolerance with respect to almond intake, whether it's acute or chronic. And this is a very typical glucose response curve showing the effects of, the effects over time, specifically with respect to the changes in glucose. So in this study, an acute single dose of almonds helped to reduce the glucose excursion. And so if you see the little triangles, trace that line there towards the bottom, and you could see that the area under the curve would be lower than the control or the potato group, for example, demonstrating improved glucose regulation. And so even an acute dose prior to a meal provides some benefit in ameliorating the glucose excursion. Here's a similar study where a single serving of almond improved glucose tolerance, and this was in relatively young, healthy adults. So in the previous slide, those were individuals at risk for type 2 diabetes. These are relatively healthy individuals demonstrating that almonds in a dose-response manner, the 30, 60, 90 grams, are demonstrating an improvement in glucose regulation postprandially. Again, another study showing a single serving of almonds acutely improved glucose tolerance in individuals who are pre-diabetic or presenting with impaired glucose tolerance. And you can see in the red curve there compared to the blue curve, there's a reduction in the area under the curve, demonstrating improvement. However, this study could not elucidate the mechanism. We don't know if this is impaired absorption of glucose in the gut or actually improvement of glucoregulatory mechanisms at the cellular level. However, this data on the right demonstrates a very similar function and showing that almonds, a single serving before a meal in type 2 diabetic patients suppress the glucose excursion, and the bar graph is a calculation of metabolic clearance of glucose, which goes up, demonstrating that this would suggest that the mechanism is at a cellular level and not just a function of gut absorption. Similarly, a study from Rick Mattis's group at Purdue showed in the really nice study here that the timing of an almond consumption is critical. And if you trace the almond group, which is in the squares on the bottom, the black squares on the bottom, you see that an almond consumption early in the morning before a meal reduce the glucose excursion, but this effect is not seen late in the afternoon, suggesting that the timing of almond consumption is important. All of those studies that I just demonstrated were a single serving or acute manipulation, and there has been a few studies showing what the effects are of chronic consumption in patients or subjects who are at risk or have type 2 diabetes. This work by Oliver Chan's group shows that chronic consumption does not show a robust effect on glucose excursion or glucose tolerance in subjects. And then on the far right, when he dissected out his data and just analyzed that in subjects with an hemoglobin A1C of less than 8%, essentially these are patients with better glucose or a better diabetic management, we still don't see a robust benefit. However, when we look at the end of study analysis, Chan et al. Demonstrated that there is a slight and modest improvement in A1C levels, which is an indicator of glucose control, as well as a modest improvement in fasting glucose levels, which is very encouraging data to suggest that almonds are having an effect. So in parting, I'll quickly summarize what I've presented here today. Chronic almond consumption can improve some metrics of glucose control, especially A1C or HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c. This is a metric used to diagnose diabetes and an indicator of glucose control. In some studies, we do see some modest improvement in fasting blood glucose or fasting plasma glucose levels in these individuals, but these changes are not consistent across studies or across populations, suggesting that further research is going to be needed to better understand other variables within population and study groups to better assess what the actual benefits are. And we see that chronic almond consumption may not be associated with consistent or sustained benefits, but improvements in postprandial glucose are seen with just a single dose pretty consistently among individuals, whether they're healthy or pre-diabetic. And lastly, when you have your almonds is really important. And so a good dose of almonds in the morning with breakfast seems to have the greatest benefit. And so study designs in the future should include these considerations going forward. But at the end of the day, the story really is that we need to do a lot more work in this area to get a better idea of what, not only how almonds are working, but to demonstrate clearly that they are beneficial for this population of individuals that are at risk or have impaired glucose tolerance. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague to describe some work that we've done recently at UC Merced. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. So for our audience in the room, first of all, thank you again for being here. I know we're a pretty cozy group here this morning, but that makes it all that more special. To put what Dr. Ortiz presented kind of in consumer speak is to really say lots of studies have been done looking at nut consumption and to see whether or not it's going to have an impact on glucose levels in someone, especially people who actually have conditions like prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And variable results have been seen. And the idea is to really understand what's going on in all these different populations. Why is it that we might be seeing results that are coming out positive in certain populations and not so much in others? And as we dissect these studies down to different levels, what Dr. Ortiz has told us is if you're actually having almonds, your postprandial glucose, which is postprandial refers to anything after a meal. So the glucose levels that spike up after the meal tend to come down. And that's great news for folks with type 2 diabetes. That's precisely what you want to keep down. And then also having almonds in the morning seems to be a really effective way of helping with glucose management. So if I've summarized your results well, okay, that's great. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Japna Dhillon. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition and Exercise Physiology at University of Missouri, Columbia. And research on almonds is not new to her. Prior to what she's going to be presenting today, she's already published her research with Dr. Richard Mattis in 2016 on blood pressure lowering effects, wow, try saying that 3 times fast, of almonds in overweight and obese adults. So without further ado, I'll give her the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Swati, for such a kind introduction, and thank you all for having me today, especially the Almond Board of California for inviting me as a speaker. I am very excited to present results from the study that we conducted at University of California in Merced. I have no disclosures to report. So before I get into that, I'd really like to talk about, the potential ways in which almonds can improve metabolic health. And as you'll see on this picture over here, almonds specifically have a host of really good nutrients. So it contains unsaturated fats, which are commonly, known as the good fats. So almonds particularly are rich in monounsaturated fats, and then have all the other good stuff like polyphenols and fiber. So that's what makes almonds so unique. It's a whole food in itself, and just having all those nutrients contained in this one package can influence several things in the body when you consume them. So you'll see over here, there are a bunch of things presented. So almonds can lead to improvements in glucoregulation. It's how your body processes blood glucose, how it processes sugars that you consume and carbohydrates that you consume. And as a result, can improve insulin sensitivity. So insulin is a hormone that regulates blood glucose, blood sugar. And you want insulin to be very efficient at lowering or regulating blood glucose. So that's what we refer to insulin sensitivity. Now, there are other studies that have shown that almonds can improve lipid profile as well, can reduce oxidative stress levels in the body, reduce inflammation. And you'll see over here with the arrows that all these things are interrelated. So typically, when you consume almonds, improvements in one factor can lead to improvements in another factor through this cascade of events that are triggered. So the point here is to show you that, even though we see improvements in, one thing, there are improvements happening in other things in the body as well. Okay. So So this study was really exciting because we focused exclusively on college freshmen. Now you may ask, why college freshmen? What's so intriguing about them? Now with the show of hands, tell me, how many of you have heard of the freshman 15 phenomenon? Okay, yes, a lot of you. So freshman 15 refers to this phenomenon where freshman students, they first enter college, they gain about 15 pounds or so of weight. Now, that number is a bit exaggerated. It's not really 15 pounds. It's much lower than that, but they still do gain weight. Now, think of this. They transition from an environment where they're nutritionally dependent on their parents or caregivers into an environment where they can do pretty much whatever they want. Hey, it's college life, right? So along with weight gain comes this increased risk of metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes, and then you have hypertension. So there are also alterations in eating behaviors. Now, if you think back to your college days, or some of you may still be in college, you probably remember, skipping breakfast the day of an exam, not as important. And then it just becomes a habit. You can end up skipping breakfast. So the purpose of this study was to see if we were to, let's say, have them come in and have them consume almonds as a morning snack, how would that affect health outcomes as well as their dietary behaviors? So we were specifically interested in these breakfast skipping freshman students. Now, the advantages of recruiting this population is that they were just 18 to 19 years of age, pretty homogeneous population. Now, as Dr. Ortiz showed, there are just so many inconsistencies with nuts and glucoregulation in the literature, and that's because, studies have recruited participants of diverse age ranges. So what happens is, you have older adults who have, impaired, let's say, glucose metabolism with age. Now you have these younger adults who may not have impaired metabolism at that age. Now you put them all together, what happens is you don't see any beneficial effects collectively. So here we wanted to focus on one homogeneous population and tease out those effects there. Now, students at UC Merced, specifically freshman students, live on campus. So we could actually closely monitor their food intake and track compliance with the intervention. So we tried this new thing with these participants. We had these undergraduate researchers who met with the participants every day for 8 weeks while they were in the study, and they had to eat their almonds in front of the peer researchers. So we could actually document that these participants were eating their almonds. Usually we have to rely on participants, to either return back their little bags in which the almonds were contained or to let us know if they ate them. But this way we could actually track the compliance. So just to give you an overview of what the characteristics of our participants looked like when we recruited them, so before they started the study. Now, those of you who conduct clinical studies, you'll know that it's really hard to get men to participate. We typically have a lot of female participants in the study. This one, it was good that we actually had almost an equal breakdown. So we still had fewer male participants, but the ratio wasn't skewed all that bad. So it's like 40% males to 50% females, approximately. In terms of race and ethnicity, because UC Merced is designated as a Hispanic Serving Institute, so we had a lot of people of Hispanic ethnicity participating in the study, and then a lot of Asians and Pacific Islanders as well. Now that is important, important point, because usually in clinical nutrition interventions, you have an overrepresentation of white populations and not so much of other races and ethnicities. And we know that certain metabolic disorders are more prevalent in individuals of other race and ethnicities, like you have Black adults and Hispanics. So this was, again, one study that where we had very diverse population, and it was not very typical of what you see in clinical interventions that over-recruit white people. In terms of the body mass index, so that tells us whether a participant belongs in the normal weight category or overweight or obese. We mostly had normal weight participants over here, and then we did have a proportion of individuals who were either overweight or obese. We also looked at the diet quality of these students before they started the intervention. And this is an index which is called the Healthy Eating Index. So participants are asked to complete these food recalls from which we can derive these indices. Now, at the very bottom, you'll see the total Healthy Eating Index score. Now, ideally, you'd want that score to be 100, because that's the maximum score you can get. And similarly, in the other categories above, you'll see the maximum possible score allowed for each of those food categories. Now, if you look at this, the healthy eating index scores of these participants was around 51 to 58, which is actually pretty representative of the average American population. But we did find some interesting differences when we looked at breakdown by sex. So women actually had better intake of fruits and vegetables, and also lower intake of sodium compared to males. So there's some teasing around to do with that data as well. So this study at UC Merced, it was an 8-week study, and it was single-blinded. That means participants, well, obviously they knew what they were getting because it's easy to differentiate, look at the food and know what it is, but we tried to keep our outcome analysis blinded, as in we didn't know which group they were in when we started our statistical analysis of the data. It was randomized. That means participants were randomized either into the Almond group or the control group, so they don't get to decide which group they want to participate in. We don't get to pick which group they're assigned to. It's a random number generator that assigns the participants to the group that they're going to eventually participate in. So almost half the participants were randomized to the almond group, where they consumed 2 ounces of whole unsalted almonds. 2 ounces would be roughly, I'd say, about 2 fistfuls. My fist, not Rudy's fist, for example. It has to be smaller fists. And those who were randomized into the control group were asked to consume about 5 sheets of Graham crackers, and they were isocaloric, so that means same calories as the almonds, about 325. Now, we actually did a focus group to identify what snacks these students commonly consumed to see what would be the most appropriate control snack. One thing that popped up was pretzels, but this is a morning study. Now, can you imagine eating 325 calories of pretzels in the morning? They possibly would not have enjoyed that, but so graham crackers was a more reasonable alternative. And then those who were in the control group were also asked to refrain from consuming nuts or nut products while they were in the study. And then we asked them to maintain consistent dietary patterns, consistent physical activity, consistent supplement use, because you don't want to change a lot of other factors. So the only change we were making was incorporating either almonds or graham crackers to their diet. So we looked at fasting glucose, so that is at fasting, so where they came in the morning after fasting for 10 hours, so they hadn't eaten anything or had anything to drink over the past 8 to 10 hours. And on the y-axis, you'll see the glucose levels, and on the x-axis are the time points. So baseline refers to before the participant started the intervention. Week 4 was 4 weeks into the intervention, and week 8 was 8 weeks into the intervention. And then the circles, the black circles, refer to the cracker group. So these are all the individual points for the participant, individual glucose values for each participant. And the triangles refer to the almond group. Now you'll see over here that there was a huge disparity between the groups at baseline, so before they started the intervention. And over time, it somehow came back. So fasting glucose levels lowered over the 8-week interventions in both the groups. So there was no statistically significant difference between the almond and the cracker groups in terms of blood glucose levels. Then we also looked at fasting insulin levels, and as I said, insulin is a hormone that can regulate blood glucose. And again, if you see this figure over here on the left, you'll see that there was actually no significant difference between the almond and the cracker group over the 8-week intervention. We also looked at fasting GLP-1 levels. GLP-1 is commonly known as an incretin, which means it enhances the secretion of insulin. So that was one reason why we measured that. And you'll see that, again, there was no difference in GLP-1 concentrations over the 8-week intervention in either the almond or the cracker groups. We looked at other metrics of metabolic health. So we looked at cholesterol indicators as well. And we found that total cholesterol and LDL actually decreased both with almond and cracker consumption. LDL is commonly known as the bad cholesterol, and HDL is known as the good cholesterol. And if you see on this graph over here, you'll see that HDL declined with cracker consumption, but there was the almond group actually, people who consumed almonds had a lower decline in the good cholesterol. So almonds ameliorated that decline in HDL cholesterol, which is a good thing because you don't want HDL to go down too much. But typically when you see cholesterol levels going down, HDL will go down along with LDL, but you want LDL to go down more compared to HDL, and that's what we saw over here. And then we also looked at endothelial function. Now, our blood vessels have the endothelial lining, so that's in the inner lining of our blood vessels. And it produces some substances that can regulate how our blood vessels relax and contract. So what we assessed with endothelial function over here is to see how well the blood flows to the arteries. Now, this was a single time point measurement, so we just did it at the end of the study. We didn't do it at baseline before the study started, so we weren't able to see any differences in endothelial function between the almond and the cracker group. Now, we've looked at all the fasting time points. Now, we're going to move on to postprandial measurement. And like Rudy and Swati pointed out, these postprandial implies after you've consumed something. Fasting is informative, but more informative is postprandial measurements. So how does your body regulate what you've eaten? And that is best captured when you measure or take blood samples right after consumption of something. In this case, what we did was we conducted an oral glucose tolerance test. So participants are given this 75 grams of glucose drink to consume. It's really, really sweet, and you have to ask the participants to really, take a few seconds, don't gulp it down, otherwise it's going to be out the very next second. So we had participants drink this 75 grams of glucose, and then we looked at several different indicators. Sorry, this seems to have minds of its own. So we looked at glucose levels, again, but these are postprandial. So time 0 over here on the x-axis refers to before they consume that 7-gram glucose drink. 15, 30, 60, and 120 refers to the time after that glucose drink consumption. Now, as expected, you'll see that glucose levels go up 15 minutes, and then they gradually start returning down to their time 0 levels. And here, again, if you look at the graph carefully, you'll notice that the almond group actually had a lower glucose concentration over the 120-minute glucose tolerance test compared to the cracker group. So we'll refer to that as glucose tolerance. So using that data, we can generate these indices called area under the curve. So it is pretty straightforward. It refers to exactly the area that's under those curves that you see for each of the groups. And that's what the figure on the right tells you, that bar graph, that the glucose area under the curve was significantly lower for the almond group compared to the cracker group. Okay, so that's good. Then we looked at the insulin profile during the glucose tolerance test, and we observed something that was good. You'll see that, again, the insulin concentrations decreased over that 120-minute time period, and greater decrease in the almond group compared to the cracker group. And our area under the curve reflects that as well. We measured C-peptide. Now, C-peptide is a marker for insulin secretion as well. It's released from the pancreas along with insulin in the same proportion, but it stays in blood much longer than insulin does, and that is why it's considered a more effective marker for insulin secretion. And it told us pretty much the same story as insulin, but it did give us more significant results in terms of that we saw greater decrease in C-peptide concentrations over the 120-minute glucose tolerance test compared to the cracker group. So now you're seeing these improvements in postprandial glucose metabolism with almond consumption. Now, we wanted to see if insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity was different between the almond and the cracker group. And you can think of them as two sides of the same coin. So insulin resistance refers to your tissues not responding to insulin effectively. Now, typically, if you have greater, you don't want too little of insulin and you don't want too much of it, because too little indicates your pancreas aren't producing enough. Too much indicates that your tissues aren't being receptive to that insulin. So it's not going to be efficient at bringing down or regulating blood glucose. So these indices are kind of just a measure of that. And so you'll see that on the first graph, almond consumption had a lower insulin resistance index compared to the cracker group, which is great. And the Mitsuda index, which is an indicator of whole body insulin sensitivity, was lower, was much higher in almond group. So insulin sensitivity was higher in almond group compared to the cracker group. Now, you've seen benefits with insulin sensitivity, benefits in postprandial glucose metabolism with almond consumption. We went a step further to go behind the scenes, to see what is contributing to these changes. And just to give you a brief overview, so now you've looked at the biological phenotype, which is the little figure in blue down there. So you're looking at fasting glucose levels, you're looking at HbA1c, you're looking at insulin, but what is driving all those changes? So we can perform this, use this tool called metabolomics to basically profile all the metabolites that are in a tissue. So for us, we collect blood samples. So we looked at all the metabolites, a snapshot of those metabolites, and perform metabolomics. Now you can do other more tests, like you can do proteomics to look at changes in proteins that are driving those changes. You can look at changes in RNA or gene expression, which RNA, you're probably very familiar with this at this time point. And you can also do genomics to see. But we're focusing on just on metabolomics at this point, but we do have another study where we're looking at gene expression changes in response to almond consumption. So this is a figure, a network analysis figure that we created. I'll walk you through some of the things. You don't need to know each and everything on this. Even I don't know each and everything. So what we did was we took a snapshot of the participants' blood samples, and we were observing the changes that were happening in response to almond consumption after a glucose drink had been consumed by the participants. So here, blue refers to an increase or greater levels in the almond group compared to the cracker group. Red refers to lower levels in the almond group compared to the cracker group. And the different shapes over here show you different metabolic pathways that are impacted. Now think of this. Just in response to one glucose drink, you have all these changes happening in the body. So most of the metabolites here that you see are being changed can impact how your body regulates blood glucose in the long term. And the changes that we're specifically seeing here are pointing towards more beneficial effects of almond consumption on glucose metabolism. So the next time you go to a doctor and you get a blood sample to look at your blood glucose, just think of like everything that's happening behind the scenes, the complexity of all that is giving you that result. So even sometimes when you might not see beneficial changes at endpoint markers, there are things happening behind the scenes that are probably beneficial. So that was the whole point of this figure. So like Dr. Ortiz pointed out, single time point studies are not always informative. You need to have longitudinal time points. That means collect samples before participants start an intervention, collect it at the midpoint, collect it at the end. If you were to only collect samples at the end, you're not going to be able to tell if the differences that you see are because of your intervention, or it could be something else. Maybe you moved states and your stress levels are high. So because a lot of those confounding variables can impact blood glucose levels as well. So that's why it's important to collect multiple samples over time. And not just fasting, but look at postprandial changes as well, because most times those are more informative than fasting time points, because that's where you're actually assessing how your body is responding to something that you're eating. And benefits can be seen over the short term with almond consumption, but consistent consumption will lead to more sustained effects. And consumption has to be maintained over the long term to maximize benefits. It's like with any healthy diet, you have to consume it consistently. It cannot be like one time point, or I'm just going to stick to my diet for a month and then I'm all set for the next year. No, it has to be consistent over a period of time to see these sustained beneficial effects. And I'd like to acknowledge the collaborators and the huge team at UC Merced that helped us run this study, and of course the Almond Board of California for funding this work. And also, again, these metabolomic studies can be extremely, extremely expensive, and they took a chance on us, and we're delivering. Just saying. This is my contact information, but I think Dr. Madan is going to be next. She'll talk about a similar study in Indian young adults who have a thin fat phenotype, and I'll hand it over to Swati to introduce her. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dillon. Phew, that was a lot to take in. How are you guys feeling? Are your blood glucose sugars low? Well, when she was talking about that really sweet drink and how if you don't gulp it down in a second that you could actually throw it back up, I saw a feverish nod in the back of the room. Looks like you've been through that. Oh boy. All right, so with that, let me please go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Like Dr. Dillon alluded, she's actually looking at a very similar study, or rather looked at and has already published, in young adolescents in India. So, and as Dr. Dillon pointed out earlier, there are certain ethnicities which, unfortunately, even at much lower blood sugar levels, can tend to have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And it's that phenotype sometimes is just has a higher tendency for these kind of conditions. And India is certainly one country. It's unfortunately known as the diabetes capital of the world. And it's because of the phenotype of the Indian population, they tend to have this condition at a much lower level of blood sugar levels. So Dr. Madan is definitely going to be giving us a little bit more insight into that. Dr. Madan is an eminent nutritionist and national president of the Indian Dietetic Association. She's also principal and professor at the Department of Food, Nutrition, and Dietetics at SVT College of Home Science, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. She's an expert on the FSSAI, which is Food Safety Standards of India, Authorities of India, scientific panels on labeling and claims advertisement, and she's a gold medalist and recipient of Young Scientist Award and Dr. Ramanathan Award by the Nutrition Society of India, which is National Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad. So with that, welcome, Dr. Madan.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. Very good morning to all of you. Am I audible and am I visible? Just a heads up.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So I bring greetings to you from India. And at the outset, it's a privilege to be a part of the annual conference of Almond Board of California 2021, Rooted in Success. Thank you very much, Almond Board of California, especially Dr. Swati, for extending this invitation and giving us an opportunity to showcase our work from India. I would have loved to be a part of this gathering in person, but due to the unprecedented pandemic times, I just could not make it. But I'm very, very glad that Dr. Somic, my colleague, is there, to represent the research team. And so basically what we will do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is that, I would set the context of, the randomized control trial, which we conducted in India. And Dr. Somic will take it forward to share the objectives and research design and finding of the study. So we're extremely proud to share today one of the landmark randomized control trial, one of its first, in India, in a population of adolescents and young adults coming from Mumbai, to see the effect of almond consumption on glucose metabolism, hyperinsulinemia, markers of inflammation, and metabolic risk factors. So, friends, why India? I think very important question, and Dr. Swati very well alluded that the latest data of IDF, indicates that India has the second highest number of people with diabetes. And what is also ironical is that India is one of the top 5 countries in the Southeast Asia with maximum number of people with diabetes. And when we look at our Indian data of ICMR, it is, a data, very huge study from 15 states of India. which quotes the prevalence of prediabetes as 10.3% and diabetes at 7.3%. But what's also shocking is to see that there's a huge number of people who are undiagnosed with diabetes. So what we are seeing today is the tip of the iceberg, and there are a lot more, basically just sitting below that borderline or in between the frank diabetes and the normalcy. And these figures have been updated in the latest, IDF Atlas of 2021, and we see these numbers going still higher. So 1 in 6 people with diabetes in the world come from India, and like I said, a huge number of people, still undiagnosed. The second important aspect about Indian population, I think, which sets the context of this randomized control trial, is that we are looking at a thin fat Indian phenotype. And we know that this phenotype clearly demarcates that Asian Indians in general have a greater insulin resistance than the Caucasians. And this thin fat Indian diabetes phenotype, which started with Dr. Yajnik and Barker's hypothesis. There is huge amount of work which has been documented by Indian scientists that it actually sets the stage for an early onset of diabetes and metabolic derangements. Now, the second important aspect to set the context of this randomized controlled trial is the snacking patterns in India. So if we see Indians, 60% of Indian are absolute snackers. They would be consuming snack more than twice a day. And there are 15% of them who are super snackers. That means they may be consuming snack 4 times a day. And COVID, actually the pandemic made those kind of lifestyle adjustments and pushed people to be, going into snacking more. And what I need to add here is that, the population which we address, that is the late adolescents and the young adults, are the ones we've done some work, and we found that, there is no concept of meal in this population. So almost 60% of their total intake comes from snacks. And the unfortunate thing is that more than 50% of what they consume is unhealthy. And not surprisingly, the baseline data of our randomized control trial clearly indicated that 89% of the study population was found to be consuming high fat, salt, and sugar snacks. Now, let me bring you back to my alma mater, where the study was conducted, that is the Sarvithal Das Thakkersi College of Home Science, which is the prestigious autonomous college of state of Maharashtra, with the coveted honor of College with Potential for Excellence, and is accredited with NAC A grade. I'm also proud to say that it's a constituent college of SNDT Women's University, Mumbai, which is the first women's university of India and Southeast Asia, and is 106 years old. This study was a collaboration of SVT Research Cell with Kasturba Health Research Society and Medical Research Center, Mumbai. And this collaboration brought together reproductive endocrinologist, doyens of reverse pharmacology, emeritus professors, eminent nutritionists, diabetic educators, and medical practitioners. The study sites were educational institutions which catered to older adolescents and young adults. And I completely reiterate what Ms. Dillo said, that even in our randomized control trial, the willingness to participate was higher in girls as compared to boys. Now, why adolescents and young adults? So, when we look at adolescents and young adults, I think they give us a window of opportunity to actually intervene very early in life, because we know that the eating behavior, the dietary patterns, the roots of these are actually set in this age group. And what is also interesting to quote is that this is the age group, which has nutrition as the lowest priority. This is also the age group, where you can make a statement looks can be deceptive, because I spoke about the thin fat Indian phenotype. So many of them, may be low BMI or normal BMI, but yet they would be carrying excess amount of fat and a higher level of inflammation, and they're not even aware, and neither do they prioritize. So overnutrition in adolescence is invariably associated with consumption of energy dense HFSS foods, and these unhealthy eating habits, formed at a younger age, can really remain a huge risk for future. And especially snacking patterns in adolescents and young adults, which I just mentioned earlier, can be a significant contributory factor towards early onset of obesity and non-communicable diseases. So this brings us to a point that early identification of adolescents and young adults with pre-diabetes, and rather I would say pre-diabetes, will aid in appropriate and timely management, intervening early and arresting the progression to diabetes and its related complications. Now, why almonds? So almonds, we know that, we value almonds as a nutrient dense snacking option. Why do we say it is nutrient dense? Because we are not only looking at good quality fat, which is the MUFA, good amount of omega-3, a very valuable nutrient in Indian context is the protein, and important vitamins like vitamin E, magnesium, besides calcium and iron, and of course, the dietary fiber and the prebiotic benefit which it brings. In addition to that, I think using almonds as a snacking option for this population was again a window of opportunity to introduce a snack which has the lowest amount of carbohydrate and is highest in the nutrient density. So, from a lens of a nutritionist and coming from India, which is a carb country, right? So, coming out with an option of snacking wherein you give minimum of carbs and yet provide maximum of nutrients was something which made the rationale of using almonds as snack for this population. I also want to reiterate that in India, the government of India, under the aegis of FSSAI, has set very stringent guidelines today, on HFSS food, the high fat, salt, sugar containing snacks, especially. And there are guidelines for school and university canteen, where I'm very happy to share that nuts like almonds make a part of the green bar of those guidelines. So actually addressing the snacking pattern of the adolescents and young adults and intervening by providing a low carb, nutrient dense snack was the basis, was the rationale, to use almonds as an intervention. And 56 grams of almonds, which almost comes to again 2 handfuls, were given to the experimental group for 3 months, that's about 90 days. And the control group was given a control snack, which was an isocaloric cereal pulse snack. So I think I would like from here my colleague, Dr. Kalita, to move ahead and share with you the objectives, the research design, and finding of the study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, Dr. Madan. That was very informative in terms of how this study in India was conducted, and I think we can all appreciate the amount of work that goes into getting some of these studies done. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Somic Kalida, who's actually going to go into the results of what the study had to show. So he's a medical doctor who founded his own company in India not too long ago in an effort to provide in-house health care to his patients. And that company really turned out to be a boon for a lot of COVID patients. From what I understand, Dr. Kalida and his doctor friends have gone through thousands of patients during COVID and have really helped save many, many lives. So thank you for that. His practice, as I just said, has been very instrumental during COVID. But aside from that, and aside from being a frontline hero, Dr. Kalida has also dedicated his life to research. He is the corresponding author on this study, and I will, with that, hand it over to Dr. Kalida.
Thank you, Dr. Kalgankar. Good morning to all of you. I guess lots of people are getting sleepy now, need some sugar snacks. Yeah. And I really thank Dr. Madan. She's actually past midnight there in India. It's around 12:30, for her to be awake and to tell us about the study. Can you go to the next slide here? Yeah. So basically, I'll just take you through this study very simply. There were lots of numbers thrown by Dr. Dhillon, and I guess you're all inundated with a lot of numbers. As a clinician, I like things to be very simple. I like to understand what I need to give to my patients, very simple ideas. Like, I don't want ambiguity. When I say you need to do physical activity, it's very easy to say do physical activity. I need to tell you how much of physical activity, what physical activity needs to be done. If I tell you change your diet, I need to tell you what sort of diet needs to be changed. What is the nutritional intervention that you need for your diet? So basically, I'll just take you through this study in a very simplistic manner, very complex study that was done in a large city, in a population which is between 16 to 25 years of age, difficult to get, but then it was done. So the study, as I told you, it's effect of almond consumption on glucose metabolism, hyperinsulinemia, markers of inflammation, metabolic risk factors. It was a randomized controlled trial in adolescents and young adults. So this form of evidence is one of the highest form of evidence in terms of the hierarchy of evidence. Our idea was to look at the effect of almond consumption on blood glucose levels, insulin levels, selected inflammatory markers. We understand that metabolic syndrome or diabetes or prediabetes, or which leads to finally heart disease, there are a lot of inflammatory markers that actually go up to cause this sort of problems. And cardiometabolic risk factors, they were adolescent and young adults, 16 to 25 years old in Mumbai in India. This was a clustered, randomized, open-label, parallel controlled trial. So what we did was we randomized two groups because, why did we do a cluster? We did cluster because there would be no contamination. You would have a group of people eating the same sort of diet. So otherwise, they would be exchanging food amongst themselves. The setting was Mumbai in India. Adolescents and young adults were our participants. The inclusion criteria was any form of impaired fasting glucose levels or postprandial glucose levels, or fasting hyperinsulinemia, which was already told to you before, or a glucose challenge hyperinsulinemia. We excluded anybody who had a chronic disease, who had any sort of allergy for nuts, infections, pregnancy, etc. Yes, this as per all clinical trial guidelines, this had an ethics approval, and this was registered in the clinical trials platform, which was finally registered with the WHO clinical trial platform. The intervention was 56 grams of almonds for 90 days, and the control was an isocaloric snack, and this was, mind you, this was not a high-calorie snack. This was basically, these were healthy snacks that were given to our participants. And the outcomes that we were looking at outcomes, glucose outcomes, we were looking at metabolic outcomes, as well as inflammatory markers. So it's a busy slide, but if you look on the right side, you'll see we actually screened around 1,313 individuals. This was from a 30,000 population. We actually went on to meet up with 30,000 people to get this number. 1,313 individuals, out of which 421 met the inclusion criteria. And finally, we had around 275 participants who consented to participate. And the numbers that you see on the screen is 219 are in the final trial, out of which 107 were in the Almond group and 112 in the control group. 24 different institutions were actually approached. I said more than 30,000 people were approached to participate in the studies. And we had to explain to them about the study because this involved blood sample collection and compliance for a period of 3 months. There were a lot of preliminary activities. I'm just trying to tell you how we go through these studies. These are done in a very, very complex manner. We developed and standardized diet recall kit. You need to understand that every 500 kilometers in India, the language changes. Every 100 kilometers, the dialect changes. And every 50 to 60 kilometers, the diet changes. So it's not going to be a standard diet. So we had to standardize the diet using a diet recall kit. We had biochemical assessments done. And also anthropometry, we measured height, weight, etc. And then we had a self-administered dietary questionnaire. Standardized diet was done using different methods, which I said. So baseline characteristic, if you look at it, the mean age was around 19.4, plus minus 1.8 years. Out of 1,313, like everybody said about the participants of women, this study was also skewed toward it, but not because of any other reason, because it was actually run by a women university, So maybe the next time we'll get more men to participate in it also. And the prevalence of overweight and obesity was 15 and 25.5% respectively. This is the age group of 16 to 25. Now, you're looking at the youngest population in the world right now. The largest population of 16 to 25-year-olds are actually in India. So you can think about the number of obese or pre-diabetic people that you would find there. If you look at the graph charts here, you'll see that 69% had normal 2-hour insulin, stimulated insulin, out of which 31% had actually abnormal, elevated 2 hours insulin, elevated insulin levels. What did we find in the study? Now coming back to the simple facts of this study. We found that almonds helped reduce HbA1c. Now as a clinician, I need hard facts. I don't work on treating a diabetic patient just by a fasting glucose or a postprandial glucose. It's difficult for me to treat anybody like that. I would need a concrete level of evidence of what was the glucose level in the last 2 to 3 months. What HbA1c does is actually measuring the fasting or the postprandial glucose levels more than 100 times over the past 2 to 3 months. And that gives us an idea whether the person has to be labeled as a pre-diabetic or a diabetic, and that's when we start treating them for diabetes. So what this study did was actually we could reduce the level of HbA1c, a very important marker for blood glucose, in just a period of 90 days. Lipids, very important. Almonds help reduce LDL cholesterol. So if you look at major studies in the world, the studies which have looked at, prospective studies which looked at the effects of lipids on heart disease, the most important marker is low density lipoprotein, LDL-C levels. And almonds actually helped reduce LDL-C levels significantly in this study. And in looking at the inflammatory markers, IL-6 is a very important inflammatory marker. These inflammatory markers actually lead to, if you see if a persistent increase in inflammatory markers could lead to heart diseases, diabetes, full-blown diabetes, etc. And IL-6 level, we could see a trend of a trend in the reduction of IL-6 level, although it wasn't statistically significant, but it was just nearing statistical significance. So the results here, in a nutshell, out of a large study done in a large population was that HbA1c reduced significantly in the almond group in comparison to the control group. The total cholesterol decreased in the almond group significantly in comparison to the control group. LDL-C reduced in the almond group, the low-density lipoprotein levels, significantly in comparison to the control group. There was a marked reduction in IL-6 level, an inflammatory marker. And postprandial insulin levels were also reduced in comparison to the control group, although it was not statistically significant. This is what the results, these look like. So the strength of the study is that a younger group, I said we are trying to catch people who are very young. These are, and we have, as I said, we have the largest youngest population in the world today of this age group. And these people have a potential to progress towards type 2 diabetes if we do not change their lifestyle. Do we have an opportunity to do that? Yes. 3 times snacking, 2 times snacking, replace those snacks, right? Did they have these snacks? Yes, they had it. People who are in the almond group, they had this snack religiously. That means there was no taste fatigue, right? That's what we found out. We did a questionnaire also where we found out that they could consume it on a regular basis. Further studies should assess, gender and socio-economic differentiations. The results definitely looked at high insulin levels, high insulin resistance level in India. And what Dr. Madan said about the thin fat, people may look thin, but then they have a lot of visceral fat. So our propensity towards diabetes is very high. Therefore, this sort of a study is very, very important to not only help people to decide on their nutritional choices as snacks, but also for governments to work on trying to bring in a positive deviance towards almonds or food like almonds. Almonds have been shown to have an effect on HbA1c on the population that we looked at, hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, and lipid profiles, as well as inflammatory markers, which means inclusion of almonds as a part of a balanced diet has the potential to be a nutritional food-based strategy to prevent progression from further metabolic dysfunction, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes. So day before yesterday when I attended the industry session, I was pleased to see that we are one of the largest importers of almonds. I really hope that the things are taken forward much faster so that it really can help not only the growers here, but people there in terms of their lifestyle modification. I acknowledge the esteemed group here, who've been a part of this team. They are the stalwarts of research in India. And we're really thankful that we had this group which could actually get this study running. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kalida, and very well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. Yes, India is definitely one of our very large export markets, and all the hard work by the growers here, if it can benefit the large Indian population for a disease that's really plagued the Indian population for a long time, I can't see a better result in terms of almonds being grown, so I think that's fantastic. I'd like to thank all of our researchers, especially Dr. Madan. To be very honest, it's 30 or 40 minutes past midnight at her end, so thank you so very much for staying up late and for presenting to our audience. We're extremely grateful for that. I also have a little token of appreciation here for all of our speakers, and Dr. Madan, we will be sending you yours via express mail. So with that, I'd like to invite questions if there are any from the audience. Anything that piqued your interest, maybe brought up a question in your mind? Yes, please come up here and introduce yourself. Thank you.
My name is Judith Myers, and I'm a registered nurse. But I had a question. Dr. Dillon mentioned a 2-ounce serving for the study that you had done, but I didn't hear the other two doctors, Dr. Ortiz or Kalida, as to what the serving size was.
So,
The serving size, yes, it was 56 grams. You'll have to convert it into ounces. How much is that?
So that's about
that's about 2
yeah,
ounces
56
as well. Yes.
grams, per day, yes. And it was divided into two times a day, twice a day.
Yeah, and just to add to that, typically a lot of these studies have been done with 2 servings, which really comes to 2 ounces or 56 grams. One serving is 28 grams of almonds. Any other questions from the audience? Okay.
I just like to, Dr. Swati, I'd just like to add here, that the quantity also has a bearing on the X percentage of the total caloric intake. So this 56 gram was based on the 20% of the total caloric intake, which that's how we came to this. Because normally you would define a snack to be contributing about close to 20% of your total caloric intake. So they need to be fitted into your total caloric intake. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. So if there are no other questions, I'd like to bring this session to a close. And thank you all very, very much for attending. We do have lunch, a seated lunch happening in Ballroom A. So if you are already registered for that, or if you've bought a ticket for that, please make your way to Ballroom A. And thank you for attending. Take care. Bye-bye.
Being a part of this gathering. Thank you very much.